January 1945. The chill of a frozen European winter was unforgiving. The sound of artillery had been replaced by the quiet groan of tanks moving over snow-covered roads. A German convoy, its vehicles shuddering beneath the weight of frozen mud, pushed forward through the countryside. The air was thick with smoke, and the smell of burning oil mixed with the crisp scent of cold. In the distance, the unmistakable hum of American fighter planes shattered the silence. The convoy, loaded with young soldiers, had nowhere to hide. They were about to collide with a force they couldn't outrun. Among the soldiers in that convoy were children, barely older than teenagers, some not even 15. They wore the same heavy woolen uniforms and the same terrified expressions as the grown men who had been sent to die in the snow. These children had been pulled from their homes, from their schools, from their families, and thrust into the heart of war. Their youth had been stolen from them, replaced by the unforgiving orders of the Reich, which believed the fight must go on at any cost. The German High Command, desperate to fill the ranks, had turned to its last reserve, its children as the convoy neared a small village on the edge of the Ardennes. The young soldiers could hear the rumble of American tanks approaching. The young boys, some no older than 12, huddled together in the cold. They were trained, but they were not soldiers. They had never held a rifle before, never understood the weight of it until it was placed in their trembling hands. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable, fear not of battle, but of death, but it was too late. The American force had them surrounded. Tanks rolled through the village streets. The sound of boots crunching through the snow and the distant voices of soldiers shouting orders filled the cold air. The German children, thrown into chaos, found themselves face to face with American troops. But there was something strange about these soldiers. It wasn't just their weapons or their uniforms. No, it was the way they looked at them, eyes filled not with hatred or contempt, but with something softer. Pity, compassion, a kind of sorrow. These young American soldiers, many of them no older than the boys they faced, knew they were not fighting for a cause, they were fighting to end the war. And in the midst of that struggle, they found themselves confronted with the faces of children, forced into a conflict that had never been their own. The soldiers' hands, once ready to pull triggers, now faltered. One American woman, a medic, stepped forward. The harsh crackle of the radio faded as she approached. She bent down to speak to one of the boys, her voice steady and calm. She called him son. And then, something extraordinary happened. The child, no older than 13, looked up at her, his eyes wide, his face streaked with dirt and fear, and began to cry. He wept as if the world had just come crashing down on him. This wasn't just the loss of war. It was the loss of innocence, the loss of childhood. He had been forced into battle, into violence, into an adulthood that was never meant for him. The word son had pierced through the shell of a soldier he had been forced to become. In that moment, he was no longer a soldier. He was just a boy again. As the other American soldiers witnessed this, they couldn't look away. The sight of the child soldier weeping in the snow, their enemy, yes, but also someone who had been dragged into the nightmare of war, just as they had been. A dozen soldiers, who had once only seen enemies on the other side of the battlefield, now saw something different. Children, just like them, thrust into a fight they hadn't started and couldn't finish. The woman who had spoken to the boy bent down and cradled his head. She said nothing else, simply offering him the warmth of her presence. The child's sobs grew louder and more desperate. Around him, other boys, no older than him, followed suit. The tension, the fear, the terror, they all melted into tears. There was no celebration in the victory, no sense of triumph over the enemy. Instead, there was only the painful realization that war had stolen their humanity. The commander of the American unit, observing this, turned away, unable to speak. He ordered the soldiers to lower their weapons. The camp was soon established, not as a place of containment, but as a space of quiet refuge. These boys, broken by their circumstances, were no longer prisoners of war, but young souls desperate to be saved. The Germans had a name for them: Kinderkommandos. The child soldiers, stripped of innocence, had been sent to fight for a dying regime. They had been given rifles too heavy for their shoulders, ordered to march into battles they did not understand, and placed in situations where survival was impossible. The Reich had treated them as tools, as expendable, as anything but human. Yet here, in the face of American troops, They were reminded of what it meant to be human, to cry, to fear, and to feel compassion. The Americans, on the other hand, saw the faces of the boys and realized the weight of their victory. It was not enough to defeat the enemy. The war had taken so much already. They knew these children were not to blame. And yet, in that moment, they were all forced to confront the deeper cost of war, one that would not be paid in territories won or battles fought, but in the silent suffering of those who had never truly chosen to fight. That day, in that quiet village, as the snow fell gently around them, history was marked by an unprecedented moment of shared humanity. For the boys, there was no going back. The war had stolen everything from them. But for the soldiers, both American and German, there was something left, a painful understanding that no side in war is untouched. And the true cost of battle is often carried in the souls of those who have no voice. As the boys were led away, some of them still sobbing, the reality of their fate settled in. They would be kept safe, sheltered from the ravages of the war they never wanted to fight. But for how long? And what would they become now that the war was over? Would they ever escape the shadows of their past? Or would they forever be haunted by the memories of a childhood lost too soon? The question lingered in the cold winter air, unanswered. And as the American soldiers looked upon them, some of them whispered quietly to one another. How many sons, lost to the fire of war, had yet to be found? The war was over, but its aftermath lingered like a heavy fog over Europe, where the cost of victory wasn't simply measured in land or lives lost. It was measured in the futures of those who had been caught in its wake. For the German child soldiers, the surrender of the Reich meant the end of one nightmare, but it did not mean freedom. It meant survival, yes, but survival without a country, without an identity. Many of them had been raised under the iron fist of propaganda, indoctrinated into a machine they had no choice but to serve. Now, they were left in a shattered world, abandoned by the very system they had once believed in the days following Germany's surrender. The Allied forces began the painstaking work of sorting through the hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Some were men, some were women, and among them, the children. Some had been captured in the final days of the war. Others had fought in earlier campaigns. Yet all had one thing in common. They had been sent to the front lines not by their own will, but by the twisted logic of a regime that would stop at nothing to protect its crumbling ideals. The Allied forces, particularly the Americans, were ill-prepared for this influx of young faces. These children had no place in the POW camps. They had not fought out of hatred or loyalty. They had fought out of sheer necessity. But now, they were no longer enemy combatants. They were children, survivors of a world torn apart by war. As the Allied forces organized their prisoners, the American women, many of the medics and welfare officers, were tasked with a new responsibility: to care for these boys. What struck them most was the silence. The boys did not speak of their pasts, of their families, or of their hopes. They had been trained not to express emotion, not to question orders. They had learned to march in step with the Reich's demands, and now that the war was over, they had no words to articulate what they had lost. Many of them were physically unscathed, but the emotional and psychological toll of their experiences was visible in their eyes. The hollow look of innocence stripped away too soon. The American women who were assigned to these child soldiers saw, perhaps for the first time, the true cost of war. Children who had lost their childhood to a regime that had no place for them. They had been taught to be killers, to be soldiers, and now they stood before the women of the enemy, who had once been their perceived foe. The women did not judge them for their uniforms or their pasts. Instead, they saw what these boys had become, victims of a war they had no hand in starting. In the camps, the American women began to take on maternal roles, comforting the boys in ways their own mothers could not. They offered food, blankets, and soft words, anything to provide comfort in a time of unimaginable loss. Some of the boys resisted this kindness. They had been trained to resist compassion, to accept only the harsh realities of war. But slowly, something shifted. The walls began to come down. One by one, the boys started to talk. They spoke of fear, the fear of being thrown into battle at an age too young to understand it. They spoke of their mothers, many of whom had died in the bombings, and of fathers who had been lost to the war. Some of them remembered a time before the war, before the uniforms and the marching, a time when they were just children playing in the fields. Those memories, so distant now, brought the boys to tears. They wept not only for their losses, but also for the life they had been denied. As weeks turned into months, these child soldiers began to transform. They helped with camp chores, worked alongside the American soldiers in rebuilding efforts, and slowly started to regain a sense of purpose, one that was no longer defined by the war. But even as they rebuilt their lives, the psychological scars remained. For many of them, the trauma of being forced into a war they did not understand would never fully heal. The American women who had cared for these boys witnessed firsthand the haunting effects of the war on its youngest victims. The emotional toll of their service was far greater than anyone had anticipated. The soldiers who had fought in the war had faced death on the battlefield. The boys who had been pressed into service had faced something even more insidious: the destruction of their innocence and the erosion of their very humanity. They had been raised to be soldiers, but now they had to learn how to be children again. It wasn't easy. The older boys struggled the most, unable to reconcile the life they had led with the one they now faced. But the younger ones, the ones who had not yet been fully indoctrinated, seemed to have a chance at recovery. Slowly, they began to laugh again. Slowly, they began to trust the American women who had shown them kindness. For some, this would be their first experience of a world outside of war, and it was the women who had given it to them. But the most poignant moment came when a group of boys, led by one who had been only 12 when the war began, presented a letter to the American women. The letter, written in shaky handwriting, read, "We are not the enemy anymore. Thank you for making us feel like we matter." For the women who had cared for these boys, it was a moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen firsthand the human cost of war, and in doing so, they had helped to heal the broken souls who had once been its most vulnerable victims. The boys, now young men, would carry the weight of their past with them forever. But they had been given a chance to rebuild, and that, in the end, was what made all the difference. The legacy of these child soldiers would not be one of hatred or vengeance. It would be one of survival, of resilience, and of the quiet power of compassion. In the end, the American women who had cared for them realized that, while war may tear everything apart, it is the human connections we make along the way that can help us put it all back together. And for these boys, that connection would be the key to their recovery. And to their future. As the months passed, the world outside the camps began to shift. The boys, once soldiers in the service of a regime that had destroyed everything around them, were now trying to find their place in a new, fragile peace. The Allies had won, but victory came at a steep cost. Across Europe, entire generations had been lost to the war, and the physical and psychological wounds would take decades to heal. In the wake of that destruction, these young German soldiers, once forced to fight for an empire that no longer existed, began the long, painful process of rebuilding their lives. For some, the transition back into civilian life was almost impossible. They had been raised on a strict diet of military discipline and duty to the Reich. Now, they faced a world where those values no longer held sway. They were expected to become normal citizens again, to go back to school, find jobs, and start families. But the shadow of war loomed over them. The trauma of their childhoods, the years spent on the front lines, and the emotional scars left by their experiences in the camps lingered. The question they would spend the rest of their lives trying to answer was, who am I now? Psychologists studying the effects of war on children soon turned their attention to these former child soldiers. They found that many of them suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, flashbacks to the battlefield, nightmares, severe anxiety, and a deep sense of loss. But there was something unique about the trauma experienced by these boys. Unlike other soldiers who had fought for a cause they believed in, these children had been robbed of their agency. They had not chosen to fight. They had been coerced, manipulated, and abandoned by a system that used them as pawns in a war they couldn't comprehend. For many of them, their memories of the war were fragmented, their understanding of it incomplete. In the years following the war, many of these boys would return to their hometowns, their villages, and their families. Some were met with indifference, others with scorn. They had been soldiers of a defeated enemy, and in post-war Germany, that label carried a heavy burden. The Allies were focused on rebuilding the country, but the stigma of defeat hung heavily on those who had been part of the war machine. For the young men who had been forced into the ranks of the Wehrmacht, the road to redemption was long and lonely. Some found solace in the quiet, small victories of rebuilding their lives. They found work, started families, and tried to forget the past, but the scars never fully healed. The emotional and psychological toll of being a child soldier remained with them, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. They would raise children of their own, who would never truly understand the horrors they had faced, but who would carry the legacy of their father's experiences nonetheless. For others, the return to normalcy was more elusive. Some turned to alcohol or other forms of escapism, trying to dull the pain of memories that would not fade. Still others found comfort in collective spaces, groups of veterans, some of whom had also been child soldiers, others who had fought on the front lines. In these groups, they could talk about their experiences without fear of judgment. But even among those who had shared similar experiences, there was an unspoken barrier. None of them could fully understand what it had been like to be forced into war as children, to lose their innocence and their childhood in the blink of an eye. The trauma that these boys carried with them was not just personal, it was generational. Many of them had been born into a world where loyalty to the Reich was expected, where duty to the Führer was paramount. They had been raised to believe in the ideals of National Socialism, only to be abandoned when those ideals crumbled. And in that moment of abandonment, their identities were shattered. They were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, to forge new identities in a world that no longer needed them as soldiers to eye in the decades that followed. Many of these former child soldiers would carry their pasts in silence. They would never speak openly about their experiences in the war, about the horrors they had witnessed, or about the decisions they had been forced to make. They would not be remembered as heroes, nor as villains, but as the forgotten children of a war that had taken everything from them. And in that silence, they would search for meaning in a world that had been broken and rebuilt time and time again. Yet, despite the silence, some of them found a way to tell their stories, not in words, but through actions. They became the architects of Germany's post-war recovery, rebuilding their country with the same resilience they had once applied to surviving the war. They worked in factories, built bridges, and created businesses. Some went on to teach, to raise children of their own, passing on the lessons they had learned in the hardest way possible. And through these small, quiet acts of creation, they found a way to reclaim their humanity. As time passed, Germany changed. The divisions between East and West, between former Nazis and former resistance fighters, began to blur. The children of the war grew up, and many of them chose to remember their fathers, not as soldiers, but as survivors. They looked at the faces of the men who had been forced to fight and saw, not enemies, but victims of a system that had stolen their youth and their future. They began to understand that their fathers, too, had been shaped by the war, shaped by a world that had demanded everything from them, leaving them with nothing but broken memories and shattered dreams. And so, the legacy of these German child soldiers, these forgotten sons, lives on. It is not a legacy of glory or honor, but a legacy of survival. A legacy of children who were forced to become soldiers, who were torn from their homes and thrust into a war they did not start, who wept when they were called sons by American women, women who saw them not as enemies, but as children in need of love and compassion. In their eyes, these boys were not killers, nor were they heroes. They were simply children who had been lost to the flames of war. And in that loss, they would find their redemption. For in the end, their story is not just one-off tragedy, but one of resilience. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, the human spirit has a way of enduring, of rising from the ashes and finding a way to rebuild. And for these boys, these sons, no matter how long it took, no matter how many years passed, they would finally find a place to call home.